Hey everyone, welcome back along to the show. So today I have with me Carlos Rivero. Carlos is an experienced chief data officer and data leader, particularly in the public sector over in the US. Carlos is here and he's going to help us unpick how the public sector uses data to better serve citizens. Really excited to have Carlos here. I've known Carlos in and around the network for a little while, but really great to have a chance to talk to him. So Carlos, welcome along to the show.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. So, right, let's get into sort of hearing a bit about you to start with, and then, yeah, really can't wait to talk about data in the public sector. I think it's impacts so many people, every individual. So, yeah, really impactful it can be. So, yeah, let's hear a bit about you to start with.
Sure. So I've been in the public sector for over 20 years. I started in science, in landscape ecology, but eventually gravitated towards GIS and geospatial data. That's where really the passion started. And so I worked as a data scientist for NOAA Fisheries for about 15 years. And then I went over to the U.S. Department of Transportation's Federal Transit Administration as their chief data officer, and then ultimately as the Commonwealth of Virginia's statewide chief data officer. So I've been in and around the data space for a long time, and been definitely dealing with a lot of public sector issues in that time, and happy to share whatever I can.
Awesome. And what's kept you in the public sector?
Service. I mean, I just love being of service, right? And I think, being able to provide services. I mean, even back in my academic days before the public sector experience with NOAA Fisheries, it was all about service, right? Serving other scientists, serving the institutions, serving academia to be able to provide products and services that are much greater than myself, right? So there you go.
Nice. For the greater good. I love it.
Always. I mean, I try. You try.
Yeah, you've got to, So, I think the really, I can't wait to get into some of the kind of how it works in public sector and that kind of thing. But I think none of it's, and to your point about service and for the greater good, I think none of how it works is important. Really, what's important is what do we achieve by doing the thing, right? So, I'd love to just sort of get going with just sort of understanding a little bit about what data is used for in the public sector in the US. And I'll be mentally comparing that to what I know about how the UK and some of Europe that I've spoken to use data. But yeah, that's a good place to start. Is sort of where are what are the big opportunities for using data in the public sector that you've seen?
So it really depends on where you are in the public sector, and I think it's a fractal problem, right? It doesn't matter what scale you look at it, you're going to have some of the same patterns showing up in data literacy, data usage, data understanding. So I call it, the data discovery, understanding, and access problems, right? But then how does an organization leverage data and what does it use it for? It depends on where that organization sits within the public sector hierarchy. So if you're talking about federal space, you're talking about, federal agencies that are providing resources, funding, grants of that, things of that nature to state and local agencies to provide services to constituents. So the federal government agencies themselves don't provide direct services to constituents. They're more about the management of these services at a very, very high level. Right. At the state level, they're usually the recipients of some of these funds, and then they distribute it down to localities and other agencies that then are directly involved and engaged with the constituents and the stakeholders. So, and then obviously localities even more so, right? The closer you are to the community, the more impact you have, the more direct contact you have. And so in the federal space, especially like I said, in NOAA Fisheries and the Federal Transit Administration, I was really involved in performance management and helping them bring data assets together that are documenting what are the different services that they're providing to the different state agencies, the different localities, and in FTA specifically, it was the different authorities, the transportation authorities, the transit authorities, right? How are they providing funding and resources and guidance to those organizations, and oversight? Obviously, oversight plays a huge role as well. And then being able to manage that. So in that space, it was really more about how do we improve the data pipeline? How do we improve and automate a lot of the data engineering processes that ultimately help result in analytics and intelligence products that the federal officials will look at and be able to make determinations about resource allocation, guidance, oversight regulations and rules, policies they need to implement, right? So that's at that level. When you talk about the state level, it's now a mix between performance management and stakeholder outcomes, right? and being able to look at the connection between the resources that you're allocating to a particular service and then the outcomes that the constituents are experiencing related to those services. Now, the interesting thing about state government is that, and local government as well, is that oftentimes the systems that are providing the services don't keep tabs on the outcomes, right? Those are completely different sectors. And a good example I like to give is like the Department of Social Services, right? Where they're providing supplemental nutrition services, they're providing supplemental financial services, housing, things like that to our most vulnerable populations, but they're not really aware if that person that they're serving got a really good paying job, or on the flip side to that, became incarcerated and now is part of the state prison system, right? That actually sits in two different agencies, right? In Virginia specifically, it was the Virginia Employment Commission that was keeping tabs on unemployment insurance and what wages you're making, what industry you're in, and that kind of stuff. But on the opposite side to that, Department of Corrections was involved in documenting whether you've been incarcerated and whether you're a ward of the state and that kind of deal. And so you can't link government services to constituent outcomes without data sharing. And so that's why data sharing is so huge in public sector space, because the systems that manage those data assets at the service level are managed in silos, right? And there's a variety of reasons for that. Operationally, it makes sense, but also we call it the color of money. How is that organization funded? And if that funding comes from a particular source, well, then you're only responsible to report to that source and not to other organizations. And then that source also puts limitations on what you can and cannot do with those data assets. And so there's a lot of rules and regulations around that govern how an organization can share data with other members of the same organization. And so that's a big role that as a CDO, as a chief data officer, you play, is being able to identify how those roles, how those rules and regulations apply to a specific data sharing initiative, and then make it happen.
Yeah. And I guess this is beyond, it's almost beyond data, isn't it? Because this is either an aspirational or a real need to join, organizations together, forget data, but join organizations together to achieve a better outcome. And if a better outcome is, improve public health or something like that, then actually there's a sensible citizen management, citizen engagement need to do that. Data is almost like one of the ways that can help them do it. So does it start with, data sharing, or does it start with someone having a desire to sort of join some dots and data sort of follows behind? How does that sort of manifest itself?
The business always leads, right? If you lead with technology, you're going to fail, right? And so the business need is always the most important driver behind all of this. But so the way I've approached this personally is that there are enterprise capabilities that you want to build for the entire organization, and that these different business use cases help you prioritize which capabilities need to be developed first and how they can play into the larger role of building out these capabilities. I mean, one of the mistakes that a lot of public sector organizations make is they treat these projects as one-off initiatives where they go off and solve this, like, for example, opioids, right? Opioid is a significant problem, I think, globally, but nationally and in different states, it's definitely a huge problem. And so they try to address that separately from like the public health issue, from like criminal justice issue. And they're all intertwined, like they're all interrelated. And so one of the things that we did early on in Virginia was we created this opioid pilot project that brought together data assets from law enforcement, public safety, health services, and community services, and then did all the analytics and provided the intelligence back into the community so that each one of those stakeholders had the same common operating picture, but using their own perspectives, right? So it's not like we gave them one dashboard and from this one dashboard, everyone should, no, because everyone's going to look at things differently, right? So being able to understand that and be able to provide that level of intelligence that drives actionable decision-making in the community where it matters most is the most important thing. And then we were able to scale that up from that one project to a statewide capability that ultimately allowed us to respond to COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine administration, and now we're using it for human trafficking, which is pretty cool.
It's kind of, I'm not sure if you use this phrase, but it's kind of single view of citizen in some ways, because you're sort of looking at triangulating, the different ways a citizen interacts with services, or either consciously or subconsciously, knowingly or unknowingly, and seeing if there's a picture that gets built up, and then you can do all sorts of interesting things. As you say, you did that for opioid challenge, but it gives you something that you can then use for managing COVID. It's either a interesting side effect or a really purposeful decision that you make to build that single view.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the most important things about all of that is privacy and confidentiality.
Yeah, I was going to ask. Yeah. Well, how does that work actually? Because there's actually quite a lot of talk at the moment, certainly in the UK, about improving services in public health and in social care, and a lot of that needs more personal data about individuals so that they can then understand more, so that they can get the insights to then improve services. But of course, with that comes some very high demand on people being open and trusting that their data is going to be used in the right way. How has that been handled over sort of history? And I'm sure that's changed quite a lot in 20 years. and is there sort of different views of how that will be handled in the future?
Yes, absolutely. So historically, it's been handled very project centric, and right. So when I first showed up in Virginia in 2018, it was point to point, and you had PII being shared all over the place because they felt like it was so sensitive that it needed to be very tightly controlled. But in that tight control, you ended up creating duplicate versions of the same to support multiple projects that have occurred over time. And so when you don't have, oh my God, are you kidding? Yeah. It's like hundreds, if not thousands, of data sharing agreements that are now including PII in them that have multiple versions and copies of the same PII, because they couldn't come to a consensus about how to manage this holistically within one environment, and at the same time keep that individual's privacy and confidentiality secure, right? Yeah. And so what I did when I got there was said, oh, wait a second. There's two types of attributes that we're working with here. One is the attributes that identify the individual, and then the other are the attributes that identify the services that individual is receiving, right? You don't need to have both at the same time, right? You need the identifying attributes to be able to link that individual across multiple systems. But once you've done that, once you've been able to identify the link of that individual across multiple systems, at that point, you no longer need the PI, you just need the services, right? And so what I did was I created I did a variety of things. One is created a legal framework called the Data Trust that really created a hub and spoke model, which is really funny, for this entire capability, right? So instead of this point-to-point network of webs of data sharing agreements, you now have this one centralized capability where it sits in the middle, and then that organization in the middle is responsible for doing the linking across all the different systems, right? And so we have separated the attributes that identify the individual. We bring those attributes in a very secure environment with very limited contact. We do all the entity resolution and matching across the different systems. And what we end up with is what we call the Universal Entity Index, which is an index, a crosswalk table that simply has a universal identifier for that individual, that unique individual, and then all their local identifiers across the multiple systems, so that whenever you wanted to see how many individuals were related across 4, 5, 6 different systems, you no longer needed their PI, you just needed the crosswalk table. Yeah. And from the crosswalk table, you're able to pull out, do queries across all, bring it all in, and then now you're only looking at service-related information, not identifying information.
Got it. Yeah, because as you say, you need to personally identify in order to match. But once you've matched, you can look at in the aggregate, you can look at trends, you can look at what's happening, and then only certain people need to know the individual. But people, policymakers and that sort of thing don't need to know, that it's Carlos. They need to know that there are a bunch of people that have demand for these services, and what's it going to cost. And so, yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that that work in a few ways. What about the kind of the citizen view of privacy, though? And consents work differently all around the world. But how much consent do you get from citizens to do those kinds of things to their data? The fact that they're giving data away through the interaction they have with the services, and then the work that's done to it. How do you get that consent? And B, again, is that a citizens trusting of that that transaction?
So there's a couple of components to that. One is in all the business systems that are collecting that data, there's a consent form and a privacy notification form. So they understand that once that data is ingested and they are receiving the provision of services from the government, that their data will be used to improve government services, evaluate, research, management, all that stuff. So that's on the one hand. On the second hand, what we also have done is that architecture that I just described lends itself perfectly nicely to create that citizen-centered portal that an individual can come in, self-identify, because we have all the information about their identity that we can match up against, make sure and verify that they are who they are, validate their authorization, and then say, this is all the data we have on you. These are all the data from all the different systems. And then the next step after that is be able to say, this is how your data is being used in different projects, and then you can consent and opt in, opt out if you choose.
Right.
So there's a lot of capabilities from that.
That's really good, and that sort of leads me to a point I wanted to raise about kind of this relationship or interaction between data and digital. So you talked about there a portal that people can access. A lot of public sector is going more digital. The way you fill in forms, the way you request changes, the way you get new licenses. Again, sort of similar questions to before about what drives the demand. Is it sort of like business led or is it data led? What drives the demand for digital services? Is it you've identified something through insight and that creates the demand, or there's clearly a demand for a digital thing here, or the reverse, or some combination?
I think it's really about the efficient delivery of services.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, that's really the most important thing, is how do we most efficiently deliver services to our constituents that provide the most value. So again, it's always business driven. And then being able to, within that context, identify what are the technologies, what are the processes that need to be invoked to make that a reality. Digital services, obviously, as smartphones have become more prolific, people now have more access to the digital economy, which is great, right? But now it's also being able to make sure that they're able to access government services through some of those same technologies. And it's very difficult, especially in the States, where there are pockets that don't have access to broadband, right? And so that's a big issue for us being able, COVID really highlighted how big of an issue that is. Yeah. And then now resources are flowing in to kind of cover that gap.
Right. Gotcha. Just sort of changing tack slightly, sort of having dug around sort of what data is used for is kind of more broadly the impact data's had. So in the way that government runs, I suppose. So I know, again, it may be cliched, but it's normally talked about that government can be slow at making decisions, slow at making change, particularly making change. Bureaucracy, getting budgets approved, often the level of pay for the people that are working there attracts a certain type of person. I suppose is that true from your experience? It is government and probably state, given some of your experience more recently. But also, is data a really strong enabler for pace, whether it's slow or not at the moment? Can data help? Does data help speed up government?
Well, so to answer your second question first, yes, data has been used to speed up government. And to address your first question about government sector employees, the majority of employees in the public sector go into for service. Yeah. Right. They know that the pay is not going to be great. It's not going to be comparable to what they would get in the private sector, but there's a mission that they feel strongly aligned with, and they want to be able to support that mission. And oftentimes what happens is that the inefficiencies of government service operations kind of get to you over time, right? Even as an employee, you're gung-ho, you really want to be able to provide a service, but sometimes there's operational friction that you experience on a day-to-day basis that ultimately, unfortunately, wears you down, right? I mean, that operational friction is real, and it is very heavy. So where data comes in, and analytics and intelligence, right? Because it's all kind of one big happy playground, is that it really facilitates the automation of a lot of the mundane tasks. It really accelerates our ability to crunch through a lot of operational statistics and data to be able to provide those stakeholders with the information they need to be able to make decisions faster, right? So beforehand, where you had to access multiple data sources and pull into an Excel spreadsheet and do your own pivot tables and do all that stuff, a lot of that stuff is automated now. And so you just have an access to a report or visualization that tells you exactly what you need to do in this particular instance and then move on. And so that, I think, is a real big acceleration, because it allows the frontline operators, who are really the ones that the public interfaces with, not me. They don't interface with me, right? I'm in the back in the closet doing all the stuff and managing all the behind the curtain. But the folks in front of the curtain that are interacting with the public really have an enhanced ability to provide better services.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's what it's all about.
Yeah. It's two sides to that, isn't there? That speed thing. There's, you say, automation, just remove some of that manual effort, the things that slow you down, the friction points. And then there's the kind of amplifier of that, which is, and because you've got the answer quicker, you can then make quicker decisions, which really is what it's about, that then helps speed up the value you return to, the people that you're interacting with. And is that kind of, do you think that's consistent across state and federal, or is that, you've seen that because you've done it and you're good at it and you made it happen? Is this common across the US, do you think, or getting there?
It's so the intent is common.
Yeah. Okay.
The execution is not. So depending on what resources you have and what operational friction as a CDO or a data analytics professional you may have within your organization, that's really going to determine the pace at which you can work, right, and deliver this value. So although, I have a lot of colleagues in the CDO space, especially at the state and federal level, that are moving along the same direction, the pace at which they're able to move is varies widely, and that's based on the operational friction that they experience on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, gotcha. Is that growth in, well, there is a growth, I think, in data leaders, whether it's CDO or not, but certainly someone responsible for, setting strategy, executing that strategy at a federal and state level. That seems to be a trend, as in a individual. I don't know if it's in all 52 states, but starting to sort of see that is that trend real, and is that making a difference, do you think?
Yes. Well, yes and yes. So the trend is definitely real. It has been growing significantly. When I was hired as the Virginia's first chief data officer in 2018, I was number 17 in the nation.
Right.
Now I think they're at 26, 27.
Okay.
Officially designated CDO positions across the 50 states. So we're getting there. There's still a lot of states that don't have CDOs, but they do have a data management professional. They do have someone involved in data governance. Like they're just because it's not a CDO doesn't mean there isn't a data professional at the helm that's kind of helping to guide this stuff forward. In the federal space, I think they've been a little bit more proactive about this, and they've noticed that having a chief data officer, a data professional, 10 years ago was important, right? And so since over 10 years ago, they've been working on this. So states have been a little behind on that, but I think one of the key things that states have an advantage over the federal space is that we have more direct access to the legislators. And so that relationship that you can cultivate with your legislators helps to kind of move things forward. Now, sometimes it hurts, right? Sometimes, it depends on your legislative branch and how they're operating, but more often than not, they also want to know, they also want to be data driven, right? They also want to understand what's going on in the state and be able to make changes that are going to be beneficial to their constituents. So having that relationship, being able to cultivate that at the state level really helps to pay dividends when you need enhanced budget, when you need to set up, we need more people, when you need additional resources.
Is the mandate for chief data officers across states consistent?
No.
So the responsibilities are different, are they? What are the differences you see?
So there's a couple of key differences. Number one is where you position in the organization.
Right.
So some states position their CDO within the office of the chief information officer, right? So they report to the CIO.
Technology.
I personally don't think that's a great approach. There are colleagues of mine that think that's the best approach because they are within a technology organization, which means they have access to resources that allow them to implement things.
Right.
But from my perspective, what that does, because to me, the value's in the business, right? And we've talked about this a bit. The value is generated in the business side of the house, right? Where the programs operate. And so if you position a CDO within the CIO shop, more often than not, the business owners, the program managers and program directors already look at that as like, well, okay, it's a technology thing. Let's just deal with it. The technology will deal with it, right? And we don't have to worry about that. And the reality is that data is a business asset, right? Its value is generated in the business. It's implemented in technology, but reality is that the value generated in the business. And so being able to provide a space for the CDO to operate between the technology and the business space is really, I think, where the most value for that position lies, because they're able to talk to both and be able to engage with both. And I think those states that position their CDO in that space are in a better posture to succeed than those who just dump them inside of a CIO shop.
Yeah. And is that so my question was about mandate and responsibility. So is that saying that if you're in technology under the CIO, that your responsibility and mandate tends to be focused around technology? It may sound like a silly question, but I don't think it's always the case that's how it would work. And if you're not inside technology, then you have access to all this other stuff that you need to do, culture and governance and quality and value and all these other things. Is that what you mean, that you sort of you get blocked off, pigeonholed into technology if you're in technology?
Yes, that's exactly right. And then your scope of work is dictated by the CIO.
Yeah.
And whatever your CIO deems important, which obviously is going to be centered around technology, there are not many CIOs that are business focused, right?
Right.
And so that is one of the main issues, where with all the things that are on the CIO's plate, cybersecurity and process management and procurement management and all that stuff, to throw data in there. I mean, so it's funny, because if you talk about the Federal Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, right, FEPA, and you see the language in FEPA, and it says specifically in FEPA that the CDO is responsible for making sure that the CIO is reporting accurately and correctly to the IT spending dashboard.
Right.
So how can you provide that level of oversight to someone you report to?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Sort of, you got that the wrong way around. Yeah. So where were you in Virginia? Where were you positioned?
So I was in the Secretary of Administration's office. I reported directly to the Secretary, as did the CIO. So the CIO and I were peers.
Right.
And that created a very, very, very good environment for us to be able to work with each other and succeed.
Yeah, I was going to say that's normally a healthy, assuming the characters and behaviors are aligned, and culture, it sort of creates a nice, healthy kind of delineation of responsibility, which is great. Cool. And I suppose we can't. I'm sort of busting to ask you about politics, basically. And I don't want to get into politics, but there's definitely this is government, right? This is decision making about citizens, but yes, there's politics, there's elections, there's staying in seat, and all these sorts of things. And the role data normally plays, and the idea of data is to support decision making and get insight into what's happening so that you can make decisions. Are those things at conflict? Can they be at conflict? Or actually is data just like the enabler that is really driving political decision making and political posturing and political gameplay and the agenda that ends up happening?
You would hope that would be the case. But the reality is that there's really two aspects of governing, right? There's the administration and operation of government, which is what we're talking about, public servants and people in that space.
Yep.
And then there's politics, right? And so previously, there have been two great books that I've read that have been fantastic about this topic. One of them is published in the 50s called How to Lie with Statistics. Oh, yeah. And the other one was published in the 80s from my GIS background, is How to Lie with Maps. Right. And so you can always torture data in all kinds of different ways, filter it and extrapolate and interpolate and do all kinds of wonderful things to data that impute that creates your version of what the narrative should be.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's going to happen. I mean, it's human nature, right? Is how I'm going to twist these facts to make them appear to support my story, whatever my story needs to be. And I think what we're moving towards is hopefully we're stuttering now. There's a little bit of stutter steps here, but as we evolve into the digital age, there's a higher level of transparency, accountability in public sector that allows the citizens to have direct access to a lot of those same data sets. Yeah. Right. And so people now have the power, and I speak directly from my experience in Virginia, where we created the open data portal, and all of the data assets that were used to publish any dashboard in any of our agencies, especially during COVID, were automatically available on the Open Data Portal so that you can cross-reference and you can check it yourself to make sure that what we were saying on a dashboard is consistent with the data that you're seeing in the environment. And it's not to say that we were filtering or removing any data assets. If it's going on a dashboard that is made available to the governor and everyone else to make decisions, it's being made available to the public as well, both the dashboard and the raw data. And I think that with data culture and that with data literacy across the board will help to start making people more aware of what is the truth, what is really happening. Because as you start to entertain that there are different flavors of truth or different perspectives of truth, and there are different perspectives, but ultimately you're looking at the same object, right? And if we're able to look at the object from all of the different perspectives on our own, then we can make, as an individual, an informed decision about how to best interpret that, and how to best make decisions for ourselves.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because you get a bit philosophical, but what is truth and what is fact, and there's always interpretation, and that's hard enough, inside a corporate organization where you're not making life or death decisions necessarily. You're deciding whether to launch a new product or move the button on a website or whatever you're trying to do. So the agenda at play is sort of slightly different. But I think there's a challenge here of balancing message with data. And of course, the storytelling is always spoken about in this space. Be good storyteller with data, but actually, with what storytelling means is creating a narrative, and the narrative is always going to be driven by the person who's presenting the story. So it becomes quite a challenge. And I saw a lot of this during COVID, where government was publishing the stats, the metrics, the graphs, the things that they were using to make their decisions, and all of a sudden, the level of not necessarily data literacy, but care and understanding that we need to be data literate, I can maybe put it that way, went through the roof. My mum cared all of a sudden about data and was spouting metrics back at me, and she'd never sort of cared before, sort of thing. So it's tricky, isn't it? I think it's tricky in politics when it comes to data, and if you overlay social media, and again, not get too far into that, it becomes quite challenging to say, well, is this data being used for the benefit of the citizen, for the constituent, for the politician, for the state? And that's a tough job, right?
It's absolutely a tough job, and I think so. There's two things that we've done to help mitigate that. One is definitely make our data assets accessible, right? And push out as much as we can. Transparency and accountability is extremely important. The other aspect of that is diversity and inclusion, right? Because like you said, one person can have a particular perspective on a topic and weave their own story, and that's the story they want to tell. But the reality is that the more diverse and inclusive community you can create around you to help provide multiple perspectives, because we all have different backgrounds, we all have different experiences that kind of feed into how we're going to interpret a particular situation, a particular stream of data, pattern, or trend, that allows us to create a message that is more wholesome and inclusive of the communities that we serve. And I think that's a huge point. And I think in the Northern administration that I was working in, we did a lot to make sure that we had as much diversity, equity, and inclusion into everything that we did, because we realized that is truly important.
Within the team who's creating kind of dashboards and insights and data products. Better represent the people that you're serving, get those perspectives, make sure you're sort of looking at it from different angles. Got it.
That's important.
No, totally great. And as you say, the transparency angle there, so making sure you think through the bigger picture, and then transparency to the people that you're serving. It's only so far you can go. As you say, the education side is the other one, and that's such a big audience that becomes a challenge. But I suppose it's been fascinating, and I've got so many different things I'd like to explore, but I suppose to kind of like draw it to a close, so to speak, is how you, and you kind of touched this at the beginning, but how you really measure progress here, because some impact, and certainly at a society level, is generational. It takes a few generations potentially to change culture for an adjustment somewhere to have proper impact. So how do you measure progress either at that kind of quite macro level, or maybe the answer, actually I might answer it myself, is at a more micro level? But yeah, how do you start to measure progress in ensuring that data is having an impact?
So it's, for me specifically, it's outcomes. So in our opioid pilot project, it was lives saved. In our workforce referral portal project, it was number of individuals gainfully employed through that process, right? Earning a livable wage, not a minimum wage, but a livable wage, right? Something that will give them enough prosperity for them to live a decent life. In the pandemic, it was, how many people were we able to get tested and then provide treatment and then ultimately limit the number of deaths, right? So saving lives again. In vaccine administration, the same thing. How do we address and identify those most vulnerable that need access to the vaccines, especially at the beginning when vaccines are very scarce, right? And so, those are the types of things that I feel are the most important measures of success. Is how are you able to provide positive outcomes for your constituents through the services that you're providing?
Yeah. No, nice. And yeah, so very specific, pointed metrics that you're trying to improve, and these are big things: deaths and lives and vaccinations are very tangible things that you can get behind. Love it.
Yeah,
brilliant. Well, yeah, this has been great, Carlos. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and you've dealt with the barrage of questions about how public sector works beautifully. So I appreciate that.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you for coming on the show and sharing some of your thoughts and views. I think it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Happy to join you anytime.
Great. And I hope that was useful for everyone listening. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you again soon.